Hello, everyone, and welcome. Bienvenue à tous et à toutes. We are really pleased to welcome you to the second event of the Conversations in Canadian Bioethics series. This series is hosted by the Canadian Bioethics Society, Société canadienne de bioéthique, and generously sponsored by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. There are a few ways you can join our conversation today. We are very pleased to have live simultaneous translation or interpretation available for this session in both English and French. Our first panelist will be speaking in French and our second in English. Our moderator will be using both languages. To hear everything in one particular language, please select that language from the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. If you can understand both languages, select off to hear everything in the original language spoken. We will be holding a discussion period at the end of both presentations. However, you may enter a question at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You may enter your question in either French or English. Your name may be mentioned alongside your question. If you do not wish your name to be mentioned, please select the option to ask your question anonymously. You can also share your thoughts about this session and suggest topics for future sessions by filling out our survey, which we very much encourage you to do, and we will post the link for that in the chat. The full session is being recorded and will be available on the CBS website at bioethics.ca. To further the goals of truth and reconciliation, I would like to acknowledge that I am joining you today from the territorial lands of the Indigenous peoples of Treaties 6 and 7 of Alberta and Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. I encourage all of you to take a moment to acknowledge the land that you're on and the Indigenous peoples, including the Métis, the Inuit, and other ancestors who have lived on and honored this land for centuries. By recognizing this history, we shine light on how our country was settled, and in the spirit of reconciliation, commit to addressing the injustices of the past and the systemic racism and oppression that continue against the Indigenous First Peoples of what is now called North America. The CBS-SCB is an interdisciplinary and interprofessional forum to discuss important topics in bioethics in Canada. My name is Victoria Sievel-Klein, and I'm the membership officer on the CBS board, and I'm also part of the subcommittee organizing this conversation series. The CBS launched the conversation series this spring to continue opportunities for dialogue throughout the year outside of our annual conference, and also to engage members or individuals who aren't yet members from diverse disciplines and backgrounds to enrich in our conversations. We have 2 upcoming episodes booked for the fall, the second of which is during National Health Ethics Week. So please keep an eye on our website or social media accounts for more information. If this is the first time you're hearing about the CBS and you would like to continue to be part of conversations like the one we'll be having today, please consider joining us by going to our website. If you join us this week, you can attend our annual business meeting, which is coming up next week. So just a reminder for all members that that's coming up as well. We do have both individual and institutional members, and the support from all of our members allows us to continue to exist as a registered charity and a nonprofit society. One thing we wanted to do in this series is to thank our supporting organizations for their ongoing support. And the supporting organization that we're highlighting at the beginning of our session today is the Nova Scotia Health Ethics Network. So I'll turn it over to Marika Warren to tell us a bit about their organization.
Perfect. Thank you, Victoria. So I'm Marika Warren. I'm the network ethicist with the Nova Scotia Health Ethics Network, or NSHEN. And next slide. So NSHEN is a collaboration between Dalhousie University, IWK Health Center, which is the Women and Children's Health Center for the Atlantic region, the Nova Scotia Department of Health and Wellness, and Nova Scotia Health. And the idea is that we have a collaboration in order to ensure that There's sharing of resources, which in the Nova Scotia context are relatively limited, but also to share the challenges and solutions and to ensure, to a certain degree, that sort of all the various players in the healthcare system in Nova Scotia are sort of singing from the same song sheet in terms of ethics. So each of those collaborating partners have a seat on our advisory council, which guides our actions. And then we have a dedicated network ethicist, which is myself, a program coordinator, who's Elizabeth Bithoff-Nielsen, and administrator, who's Krista Mleczko-Scary, who help keep things running, as well as additional support from other members of the ethics collaborations team within the Dalhousie Department of Bioethics. We are thrilled to be spotlighted as an organization and delighted to be a longtime supporter of the Canadian Bioethics Society and its work. Next slide. So in terms of things that we do, again, as I mentioned, the resources in Nova Scotia are limited. And so really, we are supporting the healthcare system, sort of wrapping around to ensure that ethics needs are met. And our big focus is really on building both capacity and confidence in addressing ethical questions. So our key functions are clinical ethics consultation, organizational ethics consultation, policy development and review, as well as ethics education. And prior to the pandemic, our focus really was more on the training side of that column, again, really building the capacity there. And as demands have increased on folks within the healthcare system through the pandemic, we've had to shift to doing more of the provision, but we hope that we'll move back to doing more of the supportive work as hopefully, she says optimistically and perhaps ill-advisedly, we move out of the acute pandemic phase here. As we're doing this work, we really do look to supplement the work that we're doing by developing resources that address the issues that we're seeing as we do our work, or that our collaborating partners identify as challenges. And so that has meant that we've put a lot of effort into developing resources which are available on our website. So I threw the link into the chat there, although we're also relatively easy to Google. And so just to highlight some of the things that we've developed and that are available for anyone who wants to make use of them. So some of you may be familiar with these, whether due to using them as a resource or having been asked to participate in their creation. But we've got a video series that we call Fireside Chats that address various issues. Our newest project is a podcast that is basically an experiment in turning some of these website resources into audio resources, recognizing that sometimes it's easier to get in through people's headphones rather than through eyeballs at the moment. We have social media accounts on both Twitter and Facebook. We've done our annual conference online for the last several years, even prior to the pandemic. And then we've a number of other resources on the website, including a case database, some plain language ethics definitions, bioethics book club, ethics after hours resources, featured article summaries, some tools and frameworks that we use around policy development and review, and many more. So to a certain degree, this is a plug to folks that we like to produce resources, but we also like to highlight voices other than our own. So bring in other perspectives. And so one of the things that COVID has, or silver lining, I guess, of COVID has been that we've gotten quite good at remote recording. And so to a certain degree, this is a blatant plug for involvement and participation in these resources. There's a non-zero chance of a request email landing in your inbox. But if you want to reach out to us with opportunities for collaboration, we'd also be thrilled to sort of share the expertise we've developed in putting these resources together and again, share them out widely. So thank you so much to the CBS for providing this opportunity to highlight the work that we're doing. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation that follows. So back over to you, Victoria.
Thank you so much, Marika, on behalf of the CBS for all of NCHEN's support over the years and all of your contributions to bioethics in Canada. It is now my very great pleasure to introduce the moderator for our session today on medical assistance in dying and mental illness. Dr. Eric Racine est un chercheur internationalement reconnu.
Dr. Eric Racine is a leading international researcher in bioethics with recognized contributions to the development of neuroethics and pragmatic ethics. He is the author of more than 200 peer-reviewed articles and the author of Pragmatic Neuroethics, Improving Treatment and Understanding of the Mind-Brain, published by MIT Press. Inspired by philosophical pragmatism, his research aims to bring to the forefront the lived experience of ethically problematic situations by patients and stakeholders, and then to resolve them collaboratively through deliberative and evidence-informed processes. Among his many roles, he is the director of the Pragmatic Health Ethics Research Unit at the Montreal Clinical Research Institute.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Bonjour à toutes et tous aujourd'hui.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I'm really very happy to be the moderator for this second Canadian bioethics conversation. I find that this initiative and others like it are more than welcome. The spaces for discussion and information are a great richness and an integral part of ethics. Thank you to the organizers who have allowed us to gather together. Today, we are addressing the issue of medical aid in dying in the context of mental health, a possibility that has brought about many, many questions, reflections, concerns, but also relief. As you can imagine, very contrasting opinions. Before I present our two panelists today, here's a little background, some things that you probably know, but just as a refresher. As you probably know, Canada's original legislation was adopted in 2016, Bill C-14, an act to amend the Criminal Code and to make related amendments to other acts. On March 17th, 2021, BC7 amended the Criminal Code, received royal assent, and came into force. It extended eligibility for MAiD to persons with serious and irremediable health problems whose natural death is not reasonably foreseeable. This added possibilities to medical aid in dying. Following the adoption of this bill, there was an exclusion for persons whose only claimed medical condition is mental illness. And this exclusion applies until March 17th, 2023. This was a 2-year period during which we asked the Minister of Health and the Minister of Justice to consult experts on, among other things, the protocols, guidelines, and safeguards that would be recommended for requests for MAiD by persons with mental illness. And the topic of the recommendation last May, very recently, the expert panel chaired by Dr. Gupta, whom we have the privilege of having with us today, tabled its report very recently. So all this is part of the context of today's discussion. Obviously, these developments raise many questions that I'm sure you have given a lot of thought to. You have probably got involved in medical assistance in dying, and my team is also working on. Today, we are very grateful to have the opportunity to discuss these issues with two leading international experts for an open and interesting discussion on this context. Before I introduce the first panelist, the first presenter,
written in the Q&A, donc dans l'option questions-réponses.
If you have questions in French.
90 minutes for the entire event, but I'll be trying to conclude a few minutes ahead of time just to make sure you have transition time for your next meeting and piece of work this afternoon. There'll be a brief survey for you to complete to allow the organizers to benefit from your feedback. Both presentations will be approximately 15 minutes long, and then we'll open up the discussion. We'll open up the floor to the open conversation. And as we do so, I will try to do my best to present your questions. Feel free to correct me along the way if I err. I may compile or synthesize questions just to make sure we kind of use our time as efficiently and as best as possible to reflect maybe some common questions or concerns. Donc, notre première présentatrice, Dr. Mona
Our first
Gupta.
presenter, Dr. Mona Gupta.
Dr. Mona Gupta is a psychiatrist and researcher at the Centre Hospitalier de l'Université de Montréal, CHUM, and associate clinical professor in the Département de Psychiatrie et d'Addictologie at the Université de Montréal. The broad theme of her academic activity focuses on the very interesting interface between ethics and epistemology in psychiatry. Her specific interests include, for example, standards of evidence and conceptions of errors in psychiatry, assessing suffering in the context of medical assistance in dying, and assisted dying for persons with mental disorders. Today, she will, for example, try to make sense of the disagreement about the incurability of mental disorders, the debate that has taken place, and I think is very central to today's conversation, because it really is central to the issue of the permissibility of MAiD or medical aid in dying for persons with mental disorders. Thank you so much, Dr. Gupta. We are all ears and looking forward to listening to you.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. Racine. Je vais juste
Thank you very
procéder
much, Dr. Racine. Let me just share my screen briefly.
Voilà. Est-ce que vous voyez bien mon écran?
Here we go. Can you see my screen?
On la voit, mais avec les diapos sur le côté. Parfait.
Yes, we see it with the slides here. Okay, once again, thank you very much to you and to the organizers for having invited me to participate here. I will have my colleague for the discussion here. I was involved in drafting 3 reports on the topic, and it's based on this involvement that I was called upon to speak at various parliamentary committees on MAiD for people who have psychiatric illness, often as a sole reason, and not only. I will be using the acronym. I've been following the political debate for a long time, and first of all, let's start with the role given to ethics in public debate on admissibility for people who have psychiatric illness. You just mentioned that I chaired a committee, but right now I am speaking on my own behalf personally. The discussion has come about around a report in Quebec. I was one of the authors that was published in December 2020. Let me read this. Nonetheless, to allow or not this form of MAiD is not an empirical question, but rather an ethical one. Empirical research can help to support certain ethical documents, but cannot replace the necessary moral deliberations. The debate around MAiD is a good illustration, even with all the knowledge we have about incurability and the decline linked to various types of maladies, but diseases such as cancer mostly, the fundamental debate concerning the ethical aspect of MAiD remains whole. When we wrote this part of the report, we did not think we were very controversial. And yet, here's the reaction that we saw to this notion in the public sphere. This was what we saw in the press or in a parliamentary committee. And this is a good example of what we see as being a lack of consensus in professional circles here. we have somebody who works in the same sphere. How can it be that there's such a gap in our understanding, especially concerning this type of ethical debate? In this presentation, I'll be trying to understand what the issue is. In the rest of my presentation, I will try to argue that one of the sources of the disagreement in the debate regards the nature of admissibility assessments. Certain people believe that these assessments should not have any ethical values. I feel that they are full of value. I'll be giving you two examples from the debate on the problem of whether mental disorders can be cured or not. Then I'll conclude and I'll have an implication with the debate. I take for required that there was at least one fundamental issue and ethical question in game that the society level, which is, should we help people to die? And in Canada, it's in fact, should we allow people to obtain assistance in death from a physician? Once we decided that as a society, we moved on to a second ethical question that is more personal. Should I help people to die? And this is where we have the conscientious objection issue. But this question is very important for our discussion today. Indeed, it recognizes that there is an additional ethical issue which goes beyond the question of ethical admissibility. There is also a third question, which occurs each time a provider has to assess a request, which is, should I help this person to die? The emphasis here is on the patient and not the physician. When in a report published last year, Samuel and myself argued that this is simply a specific question of what is to be assessed in any clinical assessment. Should I intervene with this patient right now? It is generally helped out by enlightened, informed consent and by the deontology that clinicians have towards their patients, which is to say, if a patient has a medical issue that requires a certain intervention and the intervention is available for this situation and the clinician is habilitated to provide it and there is informed consent, in most cases the ethical issue the ethical question has its answer. In fact, it's so implicit in our usual and daily activities that it may not always be clear that there is an ethical question. Here, the clinical issue is really what is at stake. And it's a question of knowing whether it has been decided or not in our society right now. Here is where we have the disagreement for the case of people with psychiatric illness and the problem of incurability or not. Once we have decided that the answer to the first question is available, then we have, according to these people, various criteria. And so then there should be none of this third question because we simply apply the general factual criteria. Doing anything else would be subjective, arbitrary, and even ideological. And then there are other people, such as myself, who believe that facts cannot cover every single case where you want to allow or exclude patients. So inevitably, we still have these ethical considerations. Let me give you a quick example. Somebody who fulfills all the criteria unambiguously would be somebody at the end of life who has terminal stage cancer, but the motive for asking for MAiD or not is that because somebody in their family will be very concerned, and in fact, they even want to seek revenge on that person, and that is why they want to ask for MAiD. And should this be taken into account? I believe it should be. Two examples now from the debate. The first example gives the idea that admissibility assessment should not be based on ethical values. This comes from a testimony to the parliamentary committee. Somebody is saying here, I do not approach these issues with any particular ideology other than my approach is based on proof. The law does not say that serious and irreversible health problems should be covered by an ethical decision. The decision should be scientific. It is impossible to make any predictions regarding mental disease, says Gaines. This is interesting that there is a difference here between proof-based and ideology. A side note here, the other interesting point in this affirmation is that if it is true that it's impossible to make any predictions in the area of mental health, then there should not really be possibility of exclusion under the law, because if it is really impossible, any such people will not be admissible. The fact that there is a debate around admissibility or incurability of mental disorders means that it is not an easy issue. In fact, people can differ as to their definition or interpretation of incurability in the area of MAiD. Very briefly, some people may feel that incurability or irreversibility, which is the second criteria, must have to be predicted with 100% validity. That is one interpretation. Another interpretation would be with uncertainty that is less than 100%, but once you have reached that less than 100% certainty, the question arises, how much certainty is enough? It's hard to say that a disease or condition is incurable and irreversible, and then we do have societal implications. Here's an excerpt, and this is my second example, an excerpt which is often cited in public debate, and you will probably recognize what is in bold here. The irreversible character of a disease is established based on an objective process that takes into account the best available medical data. For now, there is no well-defined criteria to determine that mental disease should be considered as being irremediable and at which stage it should be. For now, it is difficult to define these criteria because mental health data do not allow us to predict how the disease will evolve in a patient, and so to decree whether or not the condition is irremediable or not. Thus, each assessor may have their own interpretation of admissibility to MAiD, with as a result that any diagnosis establishing the irremediable character or not of a person's mental disease would be essentially subjective and therefore arbitrary. What's interesting in this document, because it's often the bolded part that is quoted, is that if you look at the rest, it is said that the government of Canada should set up a working group to come up with criteria. In other cases, there will be criteria, even if the proof is limited. So what will anything be based on?
Ce processus n'est pas nécessairement subjectif.
And it's recognizing that the process is not necessarily subjective because the criteria are not based on someone's preference. And it also recognizes that the criteria based on consensus will not be arbitrary because they can be justified on a rational basis. In these two examples, the ethical values play a role in terms of how we answer the first question: should we help people and their lives? But because these benchmarks cannot be actual, then when it comes to the third question, we still need to use ethical judgment. So then to conclude, the eligibility assessments when it comes to MAiD cannot be value-free. These assessments can not necessarily be subjective or arbitrary. The choice of values must be discussed, and they can be rational. And for the purpose of the discussion, we have to make room for the discussion, moral discussion, when there are so many pressures being applied to deal with this as being purely factual. And I've noticed this, and it's somewhat disheartening, because it seems that the only way we have to settle this debate is to call on the legal system. And you'll recall in this public debate, people say, well, we have to refer the matter to the Supreme Court, as if as a civil society, we can't have this debate. We have to hand it over to the Supreme Court to settle the matter. So I just wanted to share that thought with you. And with that said, I thank you, and I will give the floor to my colleague.
Dr. Racine, vous êtes sur mute.
Dr. Racine, you're muted.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation that sets the tone for the upcoming conversation. We have a second speaker, Kathleen Lowenstein, who I will introduce briefly also. Kathleen is a doctoral student at Michigan State University, whose research focuses on the ethics of mental health and illness, with a specific focus on lived experience of voice hearing and experiences commonly understood as psychosis. She is particularly interested in integrating critical perspectives into conceptualizations of ethical responses to madness and distress. Today, I believe she will talk to us about critical mental health perspectives, particularly emerging from the discipline of MAiD studies and how they relate to medical aid in dying in psychiatric cases. I believe she will critically interrogate what it means to respect autonomy in cases such as these. So Kathleen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eric. And let me just pull up the slides. As Eric said, I am a doctoral student in philosophy at Michigan State University, and my work focuses on integrating pushback from critical mental health spaces, particularly psychiatric service user and survivor activism, into our understanding of ethical responses to madness and distress. And I'm really thrilled to be presenting here with Mona today. And my presentation is going to be discussing the ethics of medical aid in dying, with a particular focus on how we think about autonomy in relation to discussions we're having around medical aid in dying in relation to psychiatric illness. So to give a brief overview of the presentation, I am going to be giving a brief overview of the literature on medical aid in dying and psychiatric illness, talking a little bit how, as Eric noted, about how we think about MAiD studies and how this might relate to some of the conversations we're having here, and then talk about some potential interventions from critical mental health perspectives into the conversation on medical aid in dying and psychiatric illness. To go into a bit more detail regarding that, I'm going to be talking about some gaps in our current framing of medical aid in dying in relation to psychiatric illness within bioethics, talk a little bit about the emerging discipline of MAiD studies and how we currently think about both madness and mental illness in bioethics, and then transition to a discussion to some interventions from critical mental health perspectives for the conversation regarding MAiD and psychiatric illness more generally. So MAiD and mental illness is an emerging topic of focus in the bioethics literature that builds on the previous literature we have regarding physician-assisted suicide and medical aid in dying more generally. And as some of the other presenters have noted, this has been prompted by legislation allowing medical aid in dying for non-terminal conditions, which has also opened up the space for consideration of physician-assisted suicide or medical aid in dying for psychiatric illness, which, as we've been talking about, has been a subject of considerable debate. Now, there's an argument that granting medical aid in dying for individuals with a diagnosis of severe mental illness is unethical as it lacks sufficient safeguards. There's a concern that the historical vulnerability of those identified as mentally ill might result in them feeling pressured or coerced to make decisions to suicide. There's also a concern that it can side with the desire to die being caused by suffering that can be alleviated with proper treatment. And similarly, there's concerns that individuals requesting medical aid in dying for psychiatric conditions may not have met standard of care for mental illness, particularly as we know that mental health treatment is often very difficult to access. And when individuals can access care, they frequently don't get what's considered to be standard of care, and they especially often don't get things that are considered to be alternative treatments that can show great efficacy in terms of experience of illness and distress, such as cognitive therapy for psychosis. Now, arguments that MAiD is ethical for psychiatric illness frequently center on arguments regarding autonomy, which is the point that I will be interrogating today. Now, there's been some pushback regarding these arguments, but the current pushback discusses the role of vulnerability in cases of physician-assisted suicide. But these perspectives have not explicitly interrogated autonomy in terms of these considerations. The typical argument framed around autonomy argues that respecting the autonomy of those with psychiatric illness involves respecting their capacity to make decisions regarding their care. So the argument in favor of psychiatric medical aid in dying extends the argument for decisions regarding care to the capacity to make the requests for MAiD in the face of intractable suffering. And as Mona noted, the degree to which suffering is intractable is something that's been very debated and something we can continue to discuss in the Q&A. But generally, the argument for autonomy and respecting autonomy in this case makes the argument that respecting individuals' capacity to make this decision is respecting autonomy more broadly. And I'm going to be raising the question of whether or not this is true and interrogating a little bit some of the framing that we have autonomy going here. And in general, the point I'm making is that we need to interrogate the stance that respecting individual capacity is respecting autonomy, given the vulnerable status of those identified as suffering from severe and intractable forms of mental distress. And in order to do that, I'm going to bring in some critical interventions from the perspective of critical mental health and specifically MAiD studies. Now, MAiD studies is an emerging academic discipline that argues that we need to think about the identity implications of diagnoses of mental illness, and it specifically argues for the possibility of madness as an aspect of identity rather than pathology. And it challenges the idea of mental illness as inherently negative and argues that it can instead be an aspect of identity. A good example of this is the Hearing Voices Network, which argues for voice hearing as a normal human experience. And similar to queer theory and arguments for LGBTQ rights, MAiD studies ask how we came to think of certain forms of mental difference as constituting illness, why we do so, and whose voices are centered in these discussions. And it rises out of a long history of mental patients' voices being silenced or ignored in clinical discourse. As Peter Beresford notes, MAiD studies can be seen as the first survivor-led movement which has sought to develop a strong philosophical and theoretical base. And this isn't to say that there wasn't a long legacy of psychiatric survivor activism, particularly in Canada, prior to the emergence of MAiD studies, but MAiD studies as a discipline is starting to codify some of that activism into those writings into like a more academic and philosophically and theoretically oriented base, similar to the way in which disability studies has received uptake in the academy. And that's very exciting because we've seen uptake of disability studies and disability perspectives into academic writings and bioethics more broadly, but the emergence of MAiD studies and the uptake of MAiD studies into this discourse is a slightly newer point of intervention. And it does bear noting that MAiD studies is not the same as anti-psychiatry. It mainly argues for centering the experience of individuals whose experience, as I noted, has been historically marginalized or ignored, and also interrogating the way in which those experiences can shape individual understanding of distress. So why MAiD studies? Well, as I noted, it allows us to acknowledge the identity-making aspect of forms of mental difference commonly understood as mental illness. And this is important because meaning-making has been listed as a key feature in integrating experiences and/or recovery, particularly from experiences commonly understood as severe forms of illness. And it also opens up the space for explicit acknowledgement of experiences of alienation and marginalization related to being MAiD-identified and/or someone identified as mentally ill, and it centers the voices of those historically most marginalized in the discourse. And this is interesting because when we think about how bioethics is historically thought about madness. MAiD Studies offers a point of intervention because bioethics' origin story includes a history of advocating for historically marginalized groups. However, this recognition of vulnerability can have the paradoxical effect of further constituting individuals as vulnerable. As Brackenbush, Bell, and Racine note, the terms vulnerable and vulnerability can have an unintended effect of stymieing rather than stimulating discussion about ethical inclusion in research, and can also lead to the exclusion of participants identified as vulnerable from the research. Similarly, thinking about individuals as vulnerable, do the diagnoses impact on individuals without addressing other factors that might motivate responses to the individual, such as assumptions of deficit, agency, or capacity? So we see this recognition of vulnerability, but oftentimes in that recognition of vulnerability, there's not a deep articulation of some of the assumptions that may be motivating that. And so insights from critical mental health make the argument that inherent assumptions within categories themselves shape a response to and understanding of experiences of distress, particularly severe mental illness. But our standard model of mental illness and the standard model within bioethics more generally, in terms of how we approach and think about ethical issues in regards to mental illness or experiences of madness and distress, often elides structural factors and considerations. If these are addressed at all, it's often done via focus on factors such as stigma, which still places the focus primarily on the individual. And this doesn't allow space for individual negotiation of the way in which responses to madness and distress shape both service user and clinician understanding and experience of illness. And so we see this lack of interrogation of the interplay between the stigmatized nature of diagnosis itself and assumptions of deficit, capacity, and agency. And we also see a lack of focus on identity aspects, which is important because, as Tanya Lerman notes, a diagnosis of severe mental illness often confers a clear identity with the diagnostic label itself. As she notes regarding the schizophrenia label, it often confers a toxic identity for those who acquire it that places them in opposition to a non-labeled social world. Similarly, Angela Woods, in her discussion of voice hearing, notes that the schizophrenia label is widely regarded as one of the most spoiled or stigmatized identities a person can be assigned through the process of psychiatric diagnosis. So what does it mean to integrate MAiD studies into our conceptualizations of ethics? Well, it involves taking a critical and self-reflexive approach to implicit assumptions within categories themselves. And the main intervention is thinking about the way in which institutional structures themselves can help to form, create, or perpetuate categories of patienthood and assumptions of deficit, agency, and capacity. And so we see this epistemological shift to meaning in states rather than an implicit assumption of deficit. So how do we place this in relation to medical aid in dying more broadly? Well, when we think about integrating perspectives from critical mental health, integrating theoretical insights into discussions of mental health and illness involves centering perspectives of MAiD-identified individuals and or consumer, survivor, or ex-patient perspectives. And this also entails rethinking some concepts such as capacity and competency distinctions, or more relevant to the discussion today, how we're thinking about conceptualizing the ethics with regards to medical aid in dying. So why medical aid in dying specifically? Well, it's an important issue because it brings out some of the important tensions in how we frame madness and autonomy. And there's been some critiques from critical disability studies regarding medical aid in dying more generally, and particularly for medical aid in dying for non-terminal forms of illness. But there hasn't been as much critique in terms of medical aid in dying for psychiatric illness. And MAiD studies opens up a point of intervention for some of that critique. And in addition, medical aid in dying in the case of psychiatric illness exposes some of the core tensions that we see in psychiatric ethics regarding questions of autonomy and consent, and it also intersects with many of the key issues raised in critical mental health more broadly. As I noted, insights from critical mental health make the argument that inherent assumptions within categories themselves shape a response to and understanding of experiences of distress, particularly severe mental illness. And so when we go back to the original argument I was talking about regarding how respecting individual capacity is respecting autonomy, we can see that in that sort of like limited framing, it's lacking in many ways. In particular, because this argument does not sufficiently interrogate factors impacting autonomy, particularly given the vulnerable status of those identified as suffering from severe and intractable forms of mental distress. So when we think about it, framing suicide as respecting autonomy can have the paradoxical effect of undermining autonomy. And so I make the argument that considerations of autonomy need to include awareness of the precarity of the subject position of those diagnosed with severe mental illness, and consideration of the ways in which structural oppression can impact desire for MAiD, which, as I noted, has been a topic of considerable focus in disability studies and disability activism, and has received some pushback from critical mental health spaces, but not as much from the perspective of MAiD studies. And also, we need to interact with the explicit we need to have an explicit interrogation of some of the identity harms that can be seen relative to diagnosis itself. So in order to think through this in a bit more detail, I wanted to talk through one case study before sort of wrapping things up, because I'm aware I'm like pushing the limits of my time here. And that case study is a case that was published in Psychiatric Services in 2020, and I'm happy to share the link to this case. It's open access if anyone wants to go and look at it. Where a patient with a long psychiatric history presented with intrusive thoughts. He had a song stuck in his head, and he reported these thoughts to be incredibly distressing. This case was in Belgium, and he made the request for medical aid in dying, and it was initially approved. On the second review of his case, as required by law, the intrusive thoughts were found to be OCD and not psychosis. The thoughts were originally diagnosed as psychosis. He was offered CBT as a result. His distress improved, and he withdrew his request for medical aid in dying. Now, the authors of this case identify two potential readings of the case. One is that one could give an argument against medical aid in dying more generally based on this, because in this case, we see a clear example of someone that one could make an argument should not have been allowed or approved for medical aid in dying at that initial stage. But they also offer the argument that this case is also a good example of safeguards working to prevent unethical cases from being approved. However, I argue that there's also a third argument relative to this case that gets at many of the core tensions I'm trying to draw out in the analysis informed by critical mental health, which is that this case exposes tensions in our framing of medical aid in dying and the ethics more broadly. In specific, it raises concerns regarding how implicit assumptions can impact seemingly objective assessments. Because in this case, we see an individual who had a primary diagnosis of psychosis, who was approved for medical aid in dying due to extreme distress he reported, but when the diagnosis was changed to something that was regarded as more open to improvement, he was offered another form of therapy, CBT, which raises questions about why he wasn't offered CBT previously. And then he improved and withdrew his request for MAiD. And this is part of the concern about how there may be implicit value judgments in some of the assessments we make regarding medical aid in dying. And if these are not specifically articulated, there's the potential for individuals to be further marginalized or further presented a distressing and negative perspective on their potential to cope with and respond to experiences of distress that might not be initially or otherwise indicated. So as I'm noting, this case and my argument more generally notes that we need a nuanced notion of autonomy and individuals' capacity and framing of these requests that places it in relation to vulnerable subject status, and that autonomy without structural considerations can further legacies of marginalization, because as many individuals with lived experience of mental illness, particularly severe mental illness, have noted, their experiences are often experiences of being sent a very devastating and distressing message about their capacity to recover from very early on into their engagement with services. As Peter Campbell notes regarding his experience with a diagnosis of schizophrenia in working with the mental health system in England, thinking of myself as having a chronic and incurable illness robbed me of power and agency and confined me within an essentially negative category. By the time I was entering my second decade of service use, the medical model, which I had initially found reassuring, seemed increasingly unsatisfactory without the capacity to compass the complexity of my interior-exterior life and give it positive value. Campbell ended up learning to live with his distress in a way that he found much more helpful, but in part his indictment of the mental health system and the negative messages that we send patients regarding care is something that I argue needs to be taken into serious consideration in our discussions of framing of MAiD more generally. So returning to the original argument that respecting individual capacity is respecting autonomy. As I noted, that's lacking in many ways because the argument does not sufficiently interrogate factors impacting autonomy, particularly given the vulnerable status of those identified as suffering from severe and intractable forms of mental difference. And as I noted, we need a nuanced notion of autonomy in relation to this. So to conclude, how do we think about autonomy in relation to medical aid and dying more broadly? Well, it's an excellent example of the tension that we see in our standard framing of autonomy within bioethics. Autonomy is framed as respecting the rights of the individual, but this is without a concomitant interrogation of the structural factors that might engender hopelessness or despair. And as I noted, this argument does not sufficiently interrogate factors impacting autonomy, particularly given the vulnerable status of those identified as suffering from severe and intractable forms of mental distress. And therefore, my argument is that autonomy without structural considerations has the potential to further legacies of marginalization. And that is the end of my presentation. And I'm going to go ahead and stop screen sharing and I guess turn it over to Eric.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. This is a really important argument, and you'll see in a minute that both talks have generated many questions already, and we'll get to these questions in a minute. But I wanted to ask if you had reactions to each other's talks at this point. Did you want to clarify points, react, make comments? I would give you at least an opportunity to do so before we dive into the many questions we have ahead of us. No, Mona, Kathleen?
I'm digesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
I think this is not something, this is a question for Kathleen, but not something that I am expecting that she's going to answer immediately, but maybe as we go along in the discussion. You know, I'm just thinking just as a clinician, and I'm thinking, you know, how to operationalize what you're saying, because I think the what you're saying makes good sense. And like I've no right to speak for all clinicians, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think that clinicians would want to do that, would not want to take some kind of black and white or one-sided perspective of autonomy, but would want to understand a request in the context of structural vulnerability. So my question is, practically speaking, how do we give life to that? But yeah, I don't expect an answer off the fly unless you have one.
Kathleen,
Yeah,
do you want to comment? Yeah.
I think a brief comment is that one way of trying to do that might be more awareness in terms of trainings or just publishing guidelines that try to take things like implicit bias into account. Because one thing that's been reported by individuals, particularly individuals diagnosed with what's considered to be more severe forms of mental illness, like schizophrenia, spectrum of other psychotic disorders, right, is that there's often an implicit bias with relation to that diagnostic category, particularly like the psychiatrist Jim Van Os has made the point that he thinks that there is iatrogenic stigma on the part of providers regarding psychosis specifically, and the capacity for individuals to live in a meaningful way with symptoms of psychosis. And I think one way of trying to respond to that and integrate that into assessments is just making individuals more aware of implicit bias, because like you're saying, I think that most providers are genuinely working from a position of wanting to help people. And part of the problem with implicit bias is we may not always be aware of it. Like, I think that's part of what was happening in the case study I was talking about. Like, they were trying to respond to the individual's distress, but there was clearly some form of bias operating with regards to the diagnostic category. And I think raising awareness about that and having more explicit discussions of that is one way of potentially intervening against that.
And Kathleen, did you have questions or comments for Mona? If not, I'm sure it's going to, there'll be opportunities as we go along, so no worries about that. I guess there's maybe a very kind of broad but perhaps meaningful question to address, is formulated by Dean Southern, who asks, is mental health a part of identity? In terms of health, how do we see mental illness? And I guess it gets to maybe the central argument by the second talk, but maybe this would be an interesting opportunity to clarify what's the relationship between mental health, identity, and mental illness also. So I don't know if you wanted to approach this, because I guess I think it's in the background in the conversation today. Anyone wants to answer? If not, we can come back to the question also. You want me to come there?
I mean, Eric, could I say one thing about it, just as a very preliminary thought? I guess I want to say, and I'm saying this again from my work as a clinician in the sub-area of psychiatry that's dedicated to the psychiatric care of people with medical conditions, so consultation liaison psychiatry, where someone lives with a condition over a long period of time. You know, I think part of what happens developmentally, psychologically speaking, is how that condition interdigitates with identity. And I don't know that it's either or. Either mental illness is an identity or it's disease. I think there's probably space for it to be both. And I think this is particularly true for chronic conditions. And I'm not speaking about psychiatric conditions. I'm speaking about any chronic conditions. Eventually, kind of the body that you are, the being that you are, that is affected by this condition, that is your identity as well. So that's just kind of a very initial reaction to that.
Yeah, and building on Mona's point, I was going to make a very similar point that I think that it really depends on the individual, the degree to which like the identity is very salient, right? Like for individuals who identify as voice hearers, it might be like a core aspect of their identity in the same way that being queer is a core aspect of an individual's identity if they're queer. But like Mona was saying, like with the experiences of people who have chronic or long-term experience of an illness, disability studies has made a similar argument that it often becomes an aspect of the individual's identity in some way, just because it's something that you're living with over a long period of time. And part of the intervention that MAiD studies is making is that one way of responding to these examples and these cases is thinking about how it's something that someone may just need accommodations to live with, and it's just a part of their life at that point, rather than a pathology that we should always be seeking to cure or eliminate.
Thank you. Here's another question which I think a lot of people have in mind. It's about, the kind of ethicality, so to speak, of offering medical aid in dying when basic healthcare may not be provided for mental health care. So here's the specific question. What are the ethical implications of offering medical aid in dying to folks with a mental health disorder when treatments are not necessarily covered or can be compensated, as opposed to, for example, a cancer diagnosis where most treatment options would be covered? And this is an anonymous question.
Mona, do you want to answer first?
I answered first the last two times, so you have to go first this time.
Yeah, I would say that this is one of my core reservations with regards to medical aid in dying for psychiatric illness, because as I noted in my presentation, as the person asking the question is also noting, access to mental health care is extremely difficult. And ideally within the guidelines, it will be written that an individual has to have, at least had some measure of treatment, though it's debated, like Mona's work is debated, the degree to which an individual should be required to try alternative forms of treatment before seeking MAiD. But there is a very real concern that an individual may be frustrated and very distressed as a result of not receiving adequate care and may seek medical aid in dying as a result of that, which I think we would all agree is a failure of the system at that point. And that's one of the very real concerns about it being legalized, is that rather than giving people the resources that they need to better cope, or even just giving them standard of care, because as I noted in my presentation, a lot of individuals with mental illness struggle to even access treatment that reaches standard of care. They may seek medical aid in dying. And I think that's something that steps need to be taken to try and make sure that individuals who are requesting it have at least had standard of care in regards to treatment. But it is very much an argument for expanded access to mental health services.
I think the only thing I would add to that is just to observe that I think the question brings together two different levels. I think it brings together kind of societal level and the individual level. So I think you can at the same time observe that and I actually don't think the question is specific to psychiatry or to mental disorders either. I think you can observe that at a societal level, there are many individuals and there are many conditions where the organization of health services is wanting. And I think you can also observe at the individual level that there are certain people who have actually had a very long and comprehensive trajectory of care and experience of illness. So those two things I don't think are contradictory. And I think, as Kathleen says, if the ethical choice is that it should be at least permitted in principle for people who have had a long and comprehensive trajectory of care and condition, then how do you capture that in a way, either in law or in guidance, that it's clear that that's who's in the net and that's who should not be considered eligible.
Thank you. We have another question, which kind of is almost like a follow-up question. And it's asking basically, something that Mona asked about is how do we translate this concern for structural factors in concrete practices? And the question is from Alan Alvarez, and it is the following. How should clinicians use or translate structural factors in supporting someone who experiences mental illness? Clinicians want to factor that, but it's unclear how, considering the resource constraints that tend to push out education, system level deliberation and similar complex interventions, I guess, be kind of integrated. So
it's my turn to go first again.
maybe, I guess.
Okay, I think Kathleen cheats because she keeps her mic off, right? And so then that way it falls to me. So I wonder again if we're maybe conflating two different levels of problem. I mean, I think by their very nature, individual clinician-patient encounters, we're not going to be resolving structural problems, right? We're going to be addressing the results of structural problems, I think. So I have to assume that the question is getting at, what can you do about the consequences of these problems at the individual level? And here I think the answer is, it's what we're doing already in care to the best of our abilities with the resources that are available to us, is making use of the different resources and services to ensure that people have the basis of what they need to be able to, I think, as Kathleen quite eloquently described, to live well, to live as best as they can, to live with meaning, etc. I think that the structural problems, though, have to be addressed further upstream, and I don't think it's going to be within the daily work of clinicians in their clinical encounters to be addressing those problems. I think those are societal problems that as a collectivity we need to address, through our elected representatives, et cetera, in terms of what are the kinds of factors that people need to do well. How do we level the playing field? How do we, as Victoria identified at the beginning, work towards combating systemic levels of oppression and disadvantage?
I would agree with Mona there that I think that that's like a problem that operates on two levels, right? Like there's the structural level in terms of just access to care and amount of care, right? Because there's often very long waiting lists for care. But I do think that that's also something that can be mediated in small ways and the level of interaction with a clinician, though I certainly wouldn't place the burden on any individual clinician to resolve everything that's happening at a structural level, because that's just impossible. But that gets back to like some of the points I was making about the potential for implicit bias training, or thinking about the way in which approaches to care are being framed, or the way interactions with the individual are being framed or understood. Like individuals who have experience of voice hearing report that they're rarely, if ever, asked what they think their voices mean, or what their experience of voice hearing are, and what they themselves find helpful in their treatment, which is frankly like shocking, right? You would think that like having conversations about what the individual themselves finds helpful would be a core aspect of treatment. And I think that there's some ways of mediating the sort of like structural distancing or structural silencing of individuals' own perspectives on their health and experiences more broadly at the level of the clinical encounter, in terms of like trying to ask more expansive questions and trying to be more creative about potential solutions to problems. Like an individual might have different ways of coping that just haven't been explored, but then you're also dealing with the structural constraints of the limited time that you have to engage with the individual. But I think this really gets to the need for expanded awareness and expanded trainings that talk about some ways of integrating these things into clinical practice, and potentially also maybe things like expanded guidelines for MAiD that also try to take these considerations into account. Because like the question is pointing out, like it can be hard to like take all of these structural critiques and then think about how to apply them on the ground. But I think a lot of that just comes down to like rethinking interactions and thinking how we can work the best that we can with the existing structural constraints that we have in place.
Thank you. We now have a question more specifically for Kathleen. And it's formulated by Lucy Costa, who first says, thank you for highlighting the importance of MAiD studies as a field and contribution. And I would second that. I think it's really a beneficial contribution to the Canadian Bioethics Society conversations. The question then is as follows. Can you please share more about the need to consider vulnerable subjectivity of a patient before we consider autonomy? I am wondering how this fits in the broad array of experiences within or outside of psychiatric services. Should we always consider vulnerable subjectivity? I'm not sure if I'm hearing you say that essentially we always need to see patients as vulnerable before considering an individual's capacity to make an autonomous decision. I don't know if you can react or comment or answer the question here.
No, I'm happy to answer the question. First of all, thank you so much for coming to the talk. And also that's a really good question. I'm glad you asked it because that's an important point of clarification. I wouldn't say that vulnerable status and autonomy necessarily exist in opposition, which isn't how your question was framing it, but is how that sometimes gets framed in non-critical uptake of discussions of vulnerability, like in some of the examples I was citing, where individuals are considered to be vulnerable populations and therefore they aren't given to stay in their care. The point I'm making is more in line with a lot of the points made within critical disability studies and critical mental health, which is that when we're thinking about autonomy, we need to think about the ways in which the way that bioethics historically has framed autonomy tends to treat individuals as like these autonomous agents, and these discussions of autonomy often don't take structural considerations that might impede on that into consideration as much as they should, right? Like disability studies makes the argument for a more expansive understanding of autonomy that understands individuals as related to a social world and also being impacted by structural constraints. And my work is trying to build on that with regards to our considerations of autonomy and mental illness, and specifically autonomy in relation to these debates that we're having about medical aid and dying. And it's not to discredit the autonomy of individuals with mental illness, because I think that individuals should very much have a say in their treatment, and that one doesn't necessarily have impaired capacity and often does not have impaired capacity as a result of mental illness. It's more to say that we might frame a decision as an autonomous decision, which is part of what the previous question was getting at regarding lack of access to care, right? When that decision has actually been prompted or mediated in some way by a lack of access to care and by the stigma the individual themselves is experiencing, which isn't to say that we should gaslight individuals about their own experiences, but that it's very important to take the consideration of structural vulnerability and the things that might be mediating that decision into consideration when having conversations about the individual's wishes, and also particularly with regards to conversations about medical aid and dying, right? Because if an individual is making requests solely for medical aid and dying as a result of lack of access to proper care, like that's something that it's very important to critically interrogate, because we don't want to say, well, the system has failed you, so you may as well die, which I think is a concern by a lot of disability activists in terms of expanding of MAiD to non-terminal illness, that individuals may feel in some ways that they're being sent the implicit message that their lives aren't worth living. And that's particularly a concern with regards to mental illness, because we know, as I was talking about in some of the examples, that individuals frequently experience a sense of hopelessness and despair regarding the possibility of recovery. And it's important to interrogate that relative to considerations of MAiD explicitly.
Yeah, very, very interesting point. I believe from having skimmed the expert report that, for example, housing is discussed as being one way that social support needs to be offered and be part of the equation, you know, and analysis here. So these are obviously really important concerns. Thank you. Maintenant, on a une question pour Dr. Gupta.
Now we have a question in French for Dr. Gupta from Félix Pajot, who says the following: as far as I know, the law is always general and cannot provide for all specific cases. If we only rely on ethics for each clinical decision, do we not need laws anymore? There should be a general ethical reflection behind each law, I feel. Yes, indeed, I completely agree. And I didn't want to give the impression that I was setting aside any ethical reflection that should occur on a general level as regards legislation. All I wanted to say is that there should be ethical reflections at all levels, up to the individual ethical decision making. And I would say that one of the reasons for which we are in this debate and this contradiction between different groups is that some think that we are dealing with factual individual decisions. We have agreed on the ethical parameters ahead of the law. We have criteria that should be applied to requests. They have to be applied. No, what I say is we can't ignore the normative aspects to see whether a person is admissible or not. To have a factual list of characteristics or criteria for admissibility cannot cover everything we think is relevant, as that's Kathleen was saying. There may be other considerations as well. Somebody who is competent, who does fulfill the other criteria, but we feel that the structural conditions were inadequate, and so then we'll maybe go towards a decision where we will at least wait. And so those considerations have to be taken into consideration at an individual level also. Thank you very much for that clarification.
A comment, and maybe we'll have time for 2 more questions following that. It's from Mary Valentish, who writes, hi, comment, feminist social work practice, not limited to social work profession, does try to integrate individual societal issues, even at the clinical encounter. Of course, this approach proceeds as sensitively as possible and in keeping with the person's situation. Timing is important. One of the problems with the traditional medical model is the separation of individual and societal matters. I had not heard of MAiD studies previously, but I imagine that this emerging area would be trying to bridge/integrate individual and structural issues. Want to comment on this? I know it's a comment. It's not really a question, but it may call for a small reaction at the very least.
Yeah, it really that's a helpful comment to make, because it really does try to integrate the individual and the structural factors, as she's noting in her comment more generally. And also it's worth noting that a lot of work in MAiD studies has come out of the perspective of social work, like some of the leading voices and individuals who helped establish MAiD studies as a discipline were social workers in Canada or in England. And so that's a really valid point to make about how feminist social work practice has long tried to integrate those things. And as I noted, MAiD Studies is trying to build on those legacies in terms of both that and critical disability studies. So I really appreciate you pointing out that that's something that there's already been work done regarding and how this is building on that previous legacy.
Thank you. If we move on to another question, this one is from Brandon Lair, who writes, you'll see it's a question about the focus of the bioethics community in a sense, and our conversations, and are we overly focused or not on issues like medical aid in dying and not, for example, innovative therapies for psychiatric conditions. I'll read the comment/question. In Canada, it will soon be the case that a physician can grant a request to kill a patient with refractory depression. However, the same physician must apply to Health Canada to provide that same patient permission to receive psilocybin-assisted therapy, a treatment recognized by the FDA as breakthrough for depression. While there are many outspoken advocates in the Canadian bioethics community describing the necessity of the liberalization of medical aid in dying legislation, there has been a near total silence regarding the effort to provide access to psychedelic-assisted therapy for Canadians. Why are the members of the CBS so overwhelmingly focused on one question and not the other? I guess this is a question for all of us, but it calls for self-reflection to us as a professional, academic society. Are we overly focused on, certain aspects and certain kinds of care and options and not on others? So the question is obviously to all of us, but do you have like critical reflections or comments or points of clarification to provide here?
I hope that the person who asked the question doesn't mind, but I want to extrapolate the question slightly and make it even more general and take it beyond actually the society and ask this question. How far do we want to go as a society, as a Canadian society, I mean, not the CBS, in saying that people should or should not have access to assisted dying until they have everything they need, right? So people don't have everything they need. That was true before MAiD, and that is true now. And oftentimes the arguments about access turn on this point. People don't have what they need, therefore, why would we make MAiD accessible when they don't have other things that they need that could help them to live better? And my question back is, how far do we want to take that logic? Do we want to say, and it's completely legitimate, we could argue it, that no, we would have to turn back the clock, but we shouldn't have access to assisted dying until we are sure that every requester has everything they need. So if we're not going to say that, though, then we're into the exercise of line drawing. Right, this is enough to say that the person has what they need. This is what society can provide, or society should go further and provide this much, but not that much. So I guess I see the psilocybin question as part of this larger issue of how much do we need to do to make sure people have what they need before they could request assisted dying. And it's a sincere question, actually.
Thank you, Dr. Gupta. Kathleen, did you also want to react or comment?
I think I have a quick reaction to that. I think Mona's right that I think implied within that question was that, ideally those individuals would be given the potential to try psychedelic treatment prior to requesting medical aid and dying. But I think that another important ethical tension to be holding in mind with regards to psychedelic treatment is that there's a lot of ethical tensions within that as well. Like it's being presented as like a, sort of like breakthrough therapy for treatment-resistant depression or for trauma. But there have been a lot of instances of individuals' vulnerable status being exploited in trials even. Like there's a case of a woman in British Columbia who was in a clinical trial for psychedelic therapy for trauma, who was exposed to terrible abuse on the part of the researchers while she was in an altered state. And I think that it's useful to be talking about expanding access potentially to psychedelic treatment if it's something that individuals find helpful, but I also have reservations about that because it also places individuals into positions where they are more easily open to potentially being abused or exploited. So that's also a tension to be holding in relation to that.
Can I add something? Which, sorry, Kathleen, is not directly in response to what you've said, but it's like an addendum to my first comment, which is if we do decide that, you know, people should not have access to assisted dying until they have certain needs met or all their needs met or whatever the decision is, my kind of addendum question is, like, that's not our standard right now for anyone with any other kind of condition. So why would that be our standard for people with mental disorders? So I mean, the answer might be along the lines of what Kathleen has sketched out. And I think we could have a discussion about whether that analysis applies only to people with mental disorders. But I wanted to just add that into my reaction to the psilocybin point.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I think it's a broader question also for all of us in this conversation about, you know, kind of checking ourselves to see if we have double standards. You know, are we considering that, you know, our standards are different when it's physical care or mental health care? And are we projecting that image also as a Canadian Bioethics Society by being engaged in this conversation? So I think this is something that comes up regularly. So thank you to the person who asked that question. There would be maybe a final question I could bring to the table before I ask you, maybe what are your takeaway points to both of you for today's conversation? It's an interesting question. Again, I'm just going to try to find it here. Oh yeah, okay. It's from Jenny Hyde, who asks, do you think having the door open to medical aid in dying assessment for those with mental health condition, that this could act as a catalyst for pushing forward the changes needed in our mental health care systems? I guess it's a question about the impact of this possibility now, which I guess March 2023, and the meaning of it. Meaning now, the meaning of why we've come to where we are, and could this serve as a catalyst for, I guess, positive changes? You know, is this something that kind of brings attention or brings more compassion and understanding, or not? I guess there are worries also that this will kind of close the discussion prematurely on the healthcare for mental illness. Do you have reactions or questions, or I guess not questions, but comments or answers? Do you have an opinion on this?
Kathleen, are you going to take a run at it first?
Yeah, I'll take a run at it. I think that it has the potential to do both. I mean, one of the concerns of activists, both within MAiD identified spaces and disability oriented spaces, right, is that it won't have any impact on the system, and that it will sort of just underwrite the idea often given to individuals with severe mental illness or severe disabilities that their life is not worth living, either through like the way in which they're treated by providers or through their interactions with the system not meeting their basic needs. And I think that's a very real concern, because as we've been noting, structural change is very difficult, and presenting individuals with the option to die in the face of a system that often doesn't support them or meet their needs can just seem to underwrite this sort of message that your life is not worth living. But I do think at the same time, it is fostering conversations like the one we're having here today about the limits of autonomy and some of the stigma that's inherent to mental illness. So I think that the optimistic reading is that it might lead to more explicit discussions about some of the determinations we make regarding care, and whether there are sometimes biases in the way we think about and approach individuals, particularly individuals with severe mental illness, and maybe open up a more explicit space for negotiating that. But I do have very real concerns that biases will not be taken into account enough, and that that will be potentially reflected in the decisions made regarding medical aid in dying.
No, I think like the fairest thing that I could say in response to the specific question about whether it's a catalyst is like, we don't know yet, right? So we'll see. We'll see to what extent, you know, these changes that are going on with respect to assisted dying are accompanied or happen in parallel with investments in other types of supports and services. You know, people have been asking for those investments well before assisted dying. So if it so happens that these developments finally make that happen, so much the better. I do wonder, though, if behind that whole that question and that whole discussion is again the conflation of different groups of people. And I think that the widespread concern about poor access to mental health services probably concerns a very large group of people who are experiencing distress, who potentially have mental disorders, who are having difficulty accessing care, and who are not requesting MAiD. And then there's, I think, what is likely to be a fairly small group of people who have probably had lots and lots of services, you know, whether they were good quality or not is a separate question, but maybe have had access to a lot of things and who might be thinking about requesting MAiD. And so I just wonder if, I worry that an investment in a whole bunch of services isn't actually going to have a big impact on that small group of people in the first place, because it's going to be directed at other people who are not requesting MAiD. It's not a bad thing, but I just think we ought not to conflate these two. There's probably more than two, but these two different groups of people. And I think that actually comes back to the psilocybin question, is how do we make sure that any investment or any new programs actually target this tiny group of people who maybe need access to innovative or promising therapies or things that are available at a great distance to where they live that they can't otherwise get access to. And then the other question about how do we make sure people who are early in the course of a condition or experiencing distress in their lives get access to basic care that anyone, you know, should want and need.
Thank you. So we are just on the verge of concluding this event, and I wanted to ask if you had any takeaways or, you know, next steps in this conversation in your eyes. Kathleen and Dr. Gupta, any words of wisdom to conclude this event? I've certainly learned a great deal. Kathleen, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think like the main takeaway I have is that I think is similar in some ways to Mona's point, though I'm going to shut up so she has time also to like add something here, but is that it's really important to be aware of what might be implicit value assumptions and some of the things that are sometimes framed as objective. And I think that's part of the argument from math studies and disability studies more broadly in terms of trying to think through our biases in response to care, even through something as seemingly objective as a person's diagnosis, right? And one of the things that I hope we can do moving forward in these conversations is be self-reflexive about that in the way in which legacies of marginalization may be playing into even stigma on the part of providers. And also my email's on my slides, and if anybody had a question that wasn't answered in the conversation, I'm happy to have more conversation about this following the talk.
I think I'm going to, my take home or it's actually an add-on to what Kathleen said, in the sense that I endorse what she's calling for. I think the end goal, though, is not the perfectly objective assessment shining up on a hill, but one in which these biases or assumptions or values can be surfaced and then be subject to debate and discussion. So I think that sometimes it's framed as we've got to get rid of these biases so that we can finally achieve objectivity. And I don't think that's actually the end goal. I think the end goal is open deliberation.
Thank you for sharing your concluding remarks, and thank you all for your active and engaging participation. We had well over 200 attendees today with us. We had 2 terrific speakers and a lot of good participation, and we are very grateful to our organizers, to the Canadian Bioethics Society, to Victoria and Daniel Bookman also, who helped organize this event. Thank you all. Victoria, did you have a final word?
Yes, thank you. I just want to thank all of you again on behalf of the CBS for your thoughtful comments, for helping to further this conversation and our reflections on this really important topic. So thank you to Kathleen and Mona. Thank you, Eric, for moderating so nicely. And we really want to thank all of our participants very much for joining us today. Please do take a moment to fill out the survey to give us your feedback. And we do hope you will join us for upcoming episodes in the fall. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today.